The wind howled through the trees, shaking the old house that stood on the edge of the forest. It had been a long time since someone had lived there, and the locals often said it was cursed. But to Emily, it was just a temporary home, quiet, isolated, and perfect for her writing. She needed peace, a break from the city's noise, and this seemed like the perfect place. It was late October, and Emily was settling in for the night, cradling a mug of tea as she curled up in front of the fire. The realtor had mentioned the house's quirks, creaky floors, occasional drafts, but to her, that added to the charm. She was alone for the first time in years, and it felt liberating. No phone calls, no interruptions, just her and her thoughts. As she was reading through some old notes for her novel, she heard it, a soft tap on the window. Emily froze, the sound cutting through the quiet like a blade. The house was isolated. No one should be out there, especially not in the middle of the woods at this time of night. She waited, breath held, but the noise didn't come again. It must be the wind, she thought, shaking off the nerves. She returned to her work, but her concentration was gone. Another tap. This time, louder, more deliberate. Her heart pounded, and she looked toward the window, its curtains drawn. For a moment, she considered opening them, but decided against it. No need to spook herself. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. She put the thought of the noise aside and tried to focus again. Minutes passed in uneasy silence before the creaking began, the unmistakable groan of floorboards shifting under the weight of something or someone upstairs. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been upstairs since she arrived. The second floor was supposed to be empty, untouched. Every instinct screamed at her to leave the house, but her rational mind pushed back. It was an old house. It made noises. But this creak wasn't random. It was steady, rhythmic, as if someone was slowly walking above her, each step louder than the last. She could almost picture it, a figure moving toward the staircase, step by step. Goosebumps prickled her skin. She rose from the couch, gripping her phone tightly, and edged toward the staircase. It was dark, the only light coming from the dim fire behind her. She stared up into the darkness, listening. Nothing. Her breath was shallow, her fingers trembling as she debated calling someone. But who? She was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the idea of explaining that she was scared of a few noises seemed ridiculous. She decided to check upstairs herself. Maybe the wind had blown a window open or a loose shutter was banging against the wall. Grabbing the small flashlight from her bag, she slowly ascended the stairs. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound echoing in the vast, silent house. When she reached the top, the air felt colder, heavier. She swept the light down the narrow hallway, revealing nothing but closed doors and dust-covered floors. The house was silent again, but that didn't ease her fear. She opened the first door, an empty bedroom untouched by time. The second door revealed the same. By the time she reached the last door at the end of the hall, she was almost convinced it had all been her imagination. Then she saw it. Faint scratches on the doorframe, almost hidden by the shadows. Emily's pulse quickened. The scratches looked fresh, long gouges that hadn't been there when she first toured the house. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. She was about to turn back when a soft, muffled sound came from behind the door, like someone breathing. Her breath hitched. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. The need to know what was behind the door was overpowering. Slowly, she turned the knob and pushed the door open, revealing a dark, empty room. The floor was covered in dust, but in the center, something caught her eye. A series of footprints, fresh, leading from the window to the closet. The window was closed. Panic surged through her veins, and her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Someone had been in the room recently. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows as she backed toward the door. The closet door creaked open, just an inch. She froze. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. She hadn't touched it, and yet it moved. For a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, the door opened wider. Emily couldn't breathe. A figure stood inside the closet, shrouded in darkness. She could barely make out its outline, but the shape was unmistakable. A person, tall, thin, unnaturally still. She stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam flickering wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching her every step. Her chest tightened with terror, and the house seemed to close in around her. Then the figure stepped forward, its footfall eerily silent despite the creaky floorboards. Emily turned and bolted, her body moving on instinct as her mind screamed in panic. She tore down the stairs, not daring to look back, but she could feel it. Something was following her. She could hear it now, the soft padding of feet, the faint rustle of clothes as the figure pursued her. She reached the front door and yanked it open, the cold night air hitting her like a slap to the face. Without thinking, she sprinted into the woods, branches whipping at her arms and face as she fled. Behind her, she could hear the rustling grow louder, faster. Emily ran until her lungs burned, until she could no longer hear anything but her own frantic heartbeat. She collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath, eyes wide and searching the darkness for any sign of movement. For a long moment, there was nothing, only silence. Then, in the distance back toward the house, she saw it. A light flickering in the window, the same room she had just fled from. And there, standing in front of the window, was the figure, watching her, unmoving. Emily's blood turned to ice. She had escaped, but it knew where she was. It had been waiting for her. Slowly, the figure raised its hand and pressed it against the glass. Its face, pale and distorted, seemed to melt into the darkness as it disappeared into the shadows of the house once more. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. She was paralyzed with fear, knowing that whatever was in that house wasn't finished with her yet. And as the wind howled through the trees once more, Emily realized she wasn't alone out here. Not anymore. The house had stood at the end of the street for decades, a dilapidated shell surrounded by rumors. No one lived there anymore, but every Halloween, teenagers dared each other to spend a night inside. Most bailed before midnight, spooked by the house's decaying interior and strange noises. But tonight, Aaron was determined to be the one who stayed until morning. He had something to prove. His friends gathered outside, waiting for him to step through the front door. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and the chill of early autumn. "Don't be stupid, man," his friend Luke warned. "Nobody's made it all the way through. There's a reason for that." Aaron smirked. "It's just an old house. Creaky floors, maybe a few rats. I'll be fine." He stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him. His friends' voices faded into silence as he found himself alone in the dark, the only light coming from the small flashlight he carried. The house smelled of rot and dust, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. Aaron scanned the foyer, the light bouncing off the peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The story said the house had once belonged to a family until they all disappeared without a trace one night. No bodies were ever found, but locals claimed to hear strange noises coming from inside, even when the house was boarded up. Aaron didn't believe in ghost stories, but as he ventured deeper into the house, an unease began to settle in his chest. The air was heavy, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Every step he took seemed louder than it should have been, echoing off the walls in a way that made him feel like he wasn't alone. He shrugged off the feeling and continued, climbing the stairs to the second floor. The wood groaned under his weight, each step protesting his presence. When he reached the landing, he paused. The hallway stretched out before him, lined with closed doors, some of them slightly ajar, as if someone had just passed through them. He moved the beam of his flashlight from door to door, the light flickering slightly. That's when he heard it, an unmistakable sound. A soft thump, like footsteps coming from behind one of the doors. Aaron froze. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination or something else, but the sound persisted, growing louder. The door at the far end of the hallway slowly creaked open, revealing only darkness beyond. His heart raced. It had to be the wind, he thought, trying to calm his nerves. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. There was no wind tonight, not inside. Aaron stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, debating whether to check it out or retreat. Pride won over fear, and he cautiously approached the open door. The room was empty, except for a small bed pushed against the far wall and a broken mirror hanging crookedly above it. His flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming. He tapped it against his palm, but the light continued to fade. Just as it was about to go out completely, he saw something in the mirror, a flash of movement behind him. He spun around, the light going dead in his hand. Aaron's breath caught in his throat as he strained to see in the darkness. He could feel something there, something watching him, but he couldn't make out what it was. The silence in the house was suffocating now, pressing in on him from all sides. And then, from behind him, he heard it. A voice. Soft. Barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Why are you here?" Aaron's blood turned to ice. He backed toward the door, every instinct screaming at him to leave. But his legs felt like lead, his feet barely moving. The air had turned cold, so cold that he could see his breath in the faint moonlight filtering through the broken window. The voice came again, this time from the corner of the room where shadows clung to the walls like thick cobwebs. "We've been waiting." Aaron's throat was dry, his mind racing. Who was we? His hand fumbled for his phone, the only source of light he had left, but when he pulled it from his pocket, the screen was cracked, black and unresponsive. From the corner, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shape, indistinct, like smoke, but it solidified into the figure of a child, a young girl, her eyes wide and dark, her skin pale and translucent. She stood there watching him, her expression unreadable. Aaron couldn't move. The girl's gaze seemed to pin him in place, her presence more than just physical. It was oppressive, suffocating. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice layered with something far older than she appeared to be. "They're coming." Aaron's pulse thundered in his ears as the temperature plummeted even further. He could feel them now, the they she spoke of. Shadows slithered across the floor, creeping toward him from every corner of the room. Faint whispers filled the air, unintelligible but growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him and the room plunged into total darkness. Aaron's panic surged. He lunged for the door, his hands scrabbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were louder now, overlapping, swirling around him like a cacophony of voices that were wrong, twisted. He could feel something moving in the room with him, circling, drawing closer. And then he felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, brushing against his arm. He yanked away, heart hammering in his chest, but it was too late. The shadows seemed to come alive, wrapping around him, pulling him back toward the center of the room. He fought, but his body felt heavy, like it was sinking into the floor itself. The whispers were deafening now, and through them he heard the girl's voice one last time. "You belong to them now." With a final desperate gasp, Aaron was pulled into the darkness, his scream swallowed by the house. Outside, his friends waited, laughing and joking, unaware of what had just happened. They figured Aaron would come out eventually, claiming victory over the haunted house. But as the night wore on and the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, the house remained silent. The front door never opened again. And from inside, if you listened closely, you could still hear the faint echo of Aaron's screams, mingling with the whispers of those who had come before him. The storm hit with a vengeance, thunder rumbling through the sky as rain battered against the windows of the old cabin. Sarah hadn't planned on staying the night. She was only supposed to pick up her family's old belongings and head back to the city before dark, but the storm came out of nowhere, trapping her miles away from civilization. No phone signal, no internet, just her and the relentless rain pounding against the roof. She wasn't scared, at least that's what she kept telling herself. The cabin had been in her family for generations, though no one had visited in years. It sat at the edge of a dense forest, the trees crowding in so close it felt like the woods themselves were trying to swallow the place whole. Her parents had told her stories about the cabin when she was younger, strange tales about things that happened here long ago. But those were just stories, right? As the rain intensified, Sarah huddled by the fireplace, watching the flames dance. The power had gone out hours ago, and she had lit every candle she could find. The flickering light cast long shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel alive, like it was breathing in sync with the storm. A sudden noise snapped her out of her thoughts. A soft knock, barely audible, against the front door. Sarah stiffened, her eyes darting toward the sound. It was late, and she hadn't seen another person since she'd arrived. The cabin was miles from the nearest road. Who would be out here in this weather? She waited, listening. The knock came again, slightly louder this time, deliberate. Sarah stood slowly, her heart racing. She crept to the door, her footsteps light on the creaky wooden floor. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky, but no one answered. The only sound was the rain, relentless and steady. She reached for the doorknob, hesitating for just a second, then pulled it open. The night was pitch black, the rain slashing sideways in the wind. She shined her flashlight into the darkness, but the beam barely pierced the thick wall of rain. No one was there. Shutting the door quickly, Sarah turned the deadbolt, trying to calm the rising sense of dread creeping up her spine. It had to be the wind, she told herself, something banging against the house. She was just on edge from the storm. But then she heard it again. This time, the knock came from the back door. Her blood ran cold. There was no way someone could have gotten from the front to the back so quickly, especially in this weather. Every rational part of her brain told her it was impossible, that she was just imagining things, but her legs moved on their own, carrying her to the back of the house. The door was slightly ajar. She hadn't noticed before, but it was open just a crack, letting in a sliver of cold, damp air. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out and pushed it closed, locking it tight. She stepped back, every muscle in her body tense, and that's when she noticed the footprints, wet, muddy footprints leading from the back door, across the kitchen floor, and disappearing into the hallway. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears. She hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone enter, but the prints were there, undeniable. Someone had been in the house, and she hadn't seen them leave. Her hand trembled as she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. She clutched it tightly, her eyes scanning the dark hallway ahead. The footprints led deeper into the house, disappearing into the shadows. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Sarah followed them. The hallway was narrow, the wooden floor groaning under her weight as she crept forward, her flashlight flickering as she swept the beam across the floor. The footprints stopped just outside the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. Slowly, she nudged the door open with the poker, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The room was empty, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The bed was undisturbed, the old curtains swaying gently despite the windows being closed. She shined the light around, her mind racing. There was no one here, no place to hide, yet the footprints had led straight to this room. Then she heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible, a faint breathing coming from behind her. Sarah froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. Slowly she turned, her flashlight flickering as the beam swung toward the hallway. There, standing at the edge of the shadows, was a figure, tall, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light from her flashlight. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs refusing to move. The figure didn't advance, didn't retreat. It just stood there, staring at her, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Sarah's mind screamed at her to run, but her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure's breathing grew louder, raspier, as if it was struggling to draw breath. Finally, it stepped forward, just a single step, but that was enough to break her paralysis. She stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug and crashing to the floor. The poker slipped from her grasp, clattering across the wood. The figure loomed closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring her fear. In a blind panic, Sarah scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door. She ran down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest as she fumbled with the front door lock. Behind her, she could hear the footsteps, soft but unmistakable, getting closer with every second. She wrenched the door open and ran out into the storm, the wind and rain lashing at her face as she sprinted across the yard toward her car. Her hands shook as she dug for her keys, her fingers slipping on the wet metal. Behind her, the cabin loomed, the front door swinging open in the wind. And there in the doorway, she saw it again, the figure. It stood just inside the house, watching her, its face still hidden in shadow. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she fumbled the key into the ignition and started the car. She didn't look back as she sped down the dirt road, the cabin disappearing behind her into the night. When she finally reached the safety of town, soaked and shaking, she told the locals what had happened. But they only exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale. One of the older men stepped forward, his voice low and serious. "You're lucky you made it out. Years ago, something happened in that cabin. A family disappeared, one by one. No one ever found them, but they say the cabin is still waiting, waiting for the next one who doesn't leave. Sarah never went back to the cabin, but late at night sometimes she can still feel the weight of that figure's stare, watching her from the shadows, waiting.